Good afternoon, women ambassadors. My name is Rocio Gunther, and I work as the Director of Constituent Services for San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg. Howdy from Texas. I'm very excited to be here today. I'll be moderating today's panel on revitalizing democracy. Since we have some limited time, I want to kick things off by letting the panelists quickly introduce themselves and including their name, professional title. And then before we get to the panel, they will answer this question in a few sentences. How do you think you are being an activist in your own work? Anya, we'll start with you, then Leticia, and finally, Michelle.
Good afternoon. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. My name is Anya Skrzypek. I am PhD and I'm Director for Research and Training at FEBS, Foundation for European Progressive Studies in Brussels. And when you ask which part of me is about being the activist, I would say my whole mind and whole heart. But in truth, what I'm trying to uphold in my professional life is keep opening political worlds to others, women and young people especially.
So the ball is on me. My name is Leticia Thyssen. I also work at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and I wanted to say thanks from the bottom of my heart also for inviting me to this really exciting event that I'm particularly delighted to be contributing to today. So it's a great pleasure. I work at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies as a gender equality policy advisor. So being an activist is not just a question; it's something that is obvious because it is part of our heart, but also as a feminist organization, FEBS, together with its member foundation, has taken the issue of gender equality very seriously. And that is also precisely where I see that this is our form of activism as part of this organization, as we try to bring together civil societies, grassroots organization on the one hand, and policymakers on the other, together with academia. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'm jumping in the pool now. Hi, everyone. Super excited to be here. My name is Michelle Mesa, and I'm a Master of Public Administration from Columbia University, recent fellow at the New York City Mayor's Office with the Inclusive Innovation Team, and former field organizer with the Biden campaign in the battleground state of Wisconsin. I would say, how do I think I am? When I think about how am I engaging as an activist in my own work, I would say first by deciding to commit and deciding to get into good trouble in anything you do. Just take a stance. If you're passionate about something, and we see inequalities all across in any system we are in, health, justice, education, just do something about it. Take a stance. A second thing I would say, how I'm an activist in my work, is keeping myself informed, not only of the problems, but actually research the solution, not just the symptoms of the problem, but actually go deep and find what are the root causes, what are the drivers of a problem. And third, be very vocal about your stances. That's something I try to do, not only research about a problem and become an expert on it, but actually be vocal, share it, spread the word, make others be as engaged as you, because activism does not start with you, but actually you are the main point, but you have to engage others, because that's the only way we change things. So I will just finish there and pass it over to you, Rocio.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, ladies. Anya, Leticia, Michelle. We'll kick it off with the first question for all of you, and that is the following, right? As we think about the topic of this panel, revitalizing democracy, we can't help but reflect on the pandemic and its immediate impact on gender equality. By the end of 2020, women's labor force participation across Latin America had fallen to 46% from 52% at the end of 2019, a record single-year drop, as 13 million women lost their jobs. Globally, women lost twice as many jobs because of COVID-19 than men. We're grappling with a she-cession all over the world as the World Economic Forum concluded in a March report that the pandemic had added 36 years to the estimated time it will take to close the global gender gap. What big structural changes are needed from governments so that women do not fall behind?
Shall I pick up immediately?
Yes.
Well, as you rightly point out, the consequences of COVID-19 have been dramatic for women. The pandemic, on the one hand, has added on the domestic care burden that women face on their everyday life, but also whilst putting predominantly female care workers under huge pressure. And therefore, we can say that COVID-19 has acted as a magnifying glass across all forms of inequalities, in fact, affecting highly feminized sectors, but also other more vulnerable groups based on race, age, class, or disability. And in fact, we do not need to think very far to confirm this reality. Who is taking care of the cleanings at home or in the office space? Who is helping parents to ensure that their children receive the care they need? Who is caring about our grandparents' day-to-day well-being? And who is giving care to the sick or those of us that might be less independent? Well, in most cases, the person that we will have in mind is a woman. And often that person also comes from a marginalized group or from the bottom of the economic ladder. And that image has quite certainly been reinforced by the pandemic with the vital work provided by essential workers, keeping afloat our society. But also highlighting the painful absence as a result of the strict lockdown measures made us realize how we depend on so many people caring on our lives on a day-to-day basis. And that is why also our recent report that we produced at FEPS, that is entitled Cherishing All Equally, Inequality and the Care Economy, has a specific emphasis on how care workers are faced with the multiple inequalities. The distribution of care namely plays a central role in the formation of inequality between women and men, and the structure of care provision or the distribution of caring responsibilities is perhaps the largest single factor in the continuation of gender inequalities. And if we are to be inclusive, credible, and effective, it has to be the work of everyone to take this issue of care seriously. And despite the applause that care workers receive, these vital roles in our societies are still undervalued and underpaid. So carers need to continue in precarious working conditions and without any sort of recognition, as care work remains invisible to the eyes of many and often fails to be acknowledged as a vital form of work. So just not until the COVID-19 pandemic that care has received so much attention, and it took a global pandemic to make us realize how crucial these care workers are, not only for our well-being, but also for our economies. And care provision systems across Europe and the world, as diverse as they may be, have failed to bring care at the core of their functioning. And a sound recovery therefore needs special attention to gender equality and to place care at its very center. The idea of building back fairer brings gender-sensitive measures to the core of the recovery report. And that is also why we have produced this policy paper at FEPS that I encourage you to look at, and I'll be happy also to share the link, which is setting forth a very concrete 10-point action plan for care economy, addressing the most urgent needs, calling first of all for the adoption of an overall people-centered approach, respecting gender equality, intersectionality, generational divides, and paying attention to all phases of life. Secondly, the crafting of sound statistical analysis and indicators to measure care, because we badly miss this type of figures. Thirdly, it calls for the establishment of care checks and care monitoring mechanisms to be included in procedures for social and economic impact assessments required before presenting any sort of legislation. Fourth, it encourages public investments in gender-proven public infrastructure, of course, here including crèche, care facilities or services for elderly family members. It is calling for the application of gender budgeting seriously across any budgets that are being applied on the national or the European level. The use of macroeconomic tools and mechanisms to put care at the center of economic activities. The redesign of tax frameworks that redirects substantial public investment in a way that values care, but also the training and education of caregivers, and last but not least, the promotion of self-care, which needs to be acknowledged for its importance rather than being undermined due to women's disproportionate unpaid care burden.
Thank you, Leticia. And now, on that note, we will play a video that highlights the importance of caring democracies, talks about care workers, and sheds further light on this topic.
Imagine living in a world where heroes are invisible. Well, this is not fantasy, this is simply our world. Throughout our lives, we depend on care. it's something we cannot do without. It took a global pandemic to make us realise how crucial these care workers are for our well-being and our economies. But despite the applause, care jobs are still undervalued and underpaid. Carers continue to work in precarious and vulnerable conditions. And who are the ones at the forefront? Women, often from underprivileged backgrounds and migrants. Most care work is not even paid at all. The essential everyday tasks at our homes remain invisible and unacknowledged. They are performed by an overwhelming majority of women. Socially constructed gender roles are behind these inequalities. The resulting physical and emotional toll inevitably prevents their economic independence. We have realised care is essential. Now we have to act on it. Our economies, our lives cannot go on forgetting that paid and unpaid caregivers are the ones that cover our most basic needs. We must value them with impactful policy changes, with a cultural and political shift in the way we organise our societies. We need to move away from a profit-driven model of growth to a care-driven model. It's time for a care revolution. We need to care for care.
Fantastic. Thanks for playing that video, tech team. Again, just highlighting these care jobs, it's so impactful to think that, minorities are greatly affected as well in these numbers, as, we have said in the past. And now for our next question, this will be for Michelle. This past year, we have heard a lot about the digital divide as we saw governments operating online and students shifting to virtual learning. As we think about the power of technology, we also need to understand that many are still left behind, right? Due to lack of access. Moreover, despite technology, there are many groups in society that are not included in policymaking and government processes and structures. We can think women, young people, and even immigrants. And this again even goes back to Caring Democracies in the video we just saw. Michelle, how can we embrace technology and inclusive innovation that incorporates these groups in a more participatory way? Along the same vein, what does open government mean to you?
Yeah, absolutely, Rocio. So I think one first thing I would say is that we tend to think as technology as a silver bullet, and that whatever policy we are working on, we just incorporate the word technology into it, and it will be magically solved, or magically will be assuming that we're going on the right direction to solve that problem. So that kind of tech savior approach, that's something that we should start thinking about, and we should start changing our mindsets as policymakers or as activists around it. So technology needs to be intentional. We need to channel it towards a purpose that relates to bridging the gaps in whatever system we're working on, redesigning systems of oppression. So technology needs to be intentional and not just assume that it will help just for the sake of it. So a second thing I will say is that technology and inclusive innovation, since the people doing the policies finally are in government, we need to engage in governments, and particularly in local governments, because local governments are the ones that are closest to the people. I have worked for the local government of New York City, and I can say that working in the inclusive innovation team made me see that governments across in different levels, but particularly local governments, require these kind of inclusive innovation teams that are only dedicated to think about how do we do things differently, how do we rethink the ways of doing policy making, how do we guide our policies better towards making them more participatory, more not only inclusive, but actually inclusive in a passive way, where citizens are just weigh in at some point and we'll just get their input, but we don't really we do it more as a formality, or we do it more in a decorative or ornamental way, but rather just getting this feedback and answering to it. So that feedback loop needs to be a closed circle, and that's something that it tends to be just a one-way thing, where we grab input from citizens and we don't do anything about it, and we just get the nice picture with them and say we included them, but that's not really what's happening in the end. And the reality is that citizens know better than public servants what their problems are. So that's like, technology needs to incorporate this idea, and public servants have this mindset, and governments have these inclusive innovation teams that are intentional about how do we do things differently, and how do we use technology as a mean to create this participation, this real participation, away from tokenism, away from nice pictures and words, but actually have citizens fully incorporate into the policymaking cycle, from the design stage to the evaluation and to the escalation stage, and all across the cycle. And when you ask, Rocio, what is open government? I think if we understand governance as a relationship between citizens and government, open government is about making this relationship that tends to be characterized by secrecy, by complex procedures that citizens really don't understand. So there is not a fluid communication. It's about making it more open. It's about making it more citizen friendly. It's about making it easier for citizens to knock the doors of government without just having 100 barriers in between. So it's a two-way street. It's about government supplying the information, but also having the structures to respond to any answers that citizens want to give to that supply of information. So if government just releases information, it's not only about being open about this information, but also being ready for citizens to react to that information and provide an input and say, I understand how you're doing things, but I would like this. This will help my life get better. So it's about government incorporating and taking action on that feedback. So I would just stop there and pass it over to you, Rocio.
That's great. It really reminds me about something I heard recently, which is that a lot of times people are just interested in doing the minimum and ticking the box, right? But it's not fully genuine. It's not really putting in the work to make it truly inclusive and reach all our communities. So thank you, Michelle. These are very good points. And now we'll be going to Anya with this following question. Thanks all. This has been just so enriching so far. It's so exciting to be a part of this. Germany's Angela Merkel and New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern are two examples of strong women leaders. Women leaders rose to the top during the pandemic, and they were applauded for their leadership during such an unprecedented time. Beyond the pandemic, issues like maternity leave and gender quotas are some of the topics that these women have brought to the table. Jacinda Ardern took a 6-week leave from office after the birth of her child, making her the first elected leader to take maternity leave. Merkel's party introduced a gender quota to generate a critical mass of women in politics. Please reflect and share your thoughts about how these two women and others that I may not have mentioned have pushed gender parity to the forefront as it comes to governing, and what actions can future women leaders take to bridge public and private life so that other women are not left outside of politics.
Thank you, Rocio, and evidently a very controversial question, because putting Angela Merkel and Jacinda Ardern in one sentence or equation is something that is terrifying as a thought, I have to say, because not only in terms of leadership style, but also political priorities and way of representing women, those two female leaders probably couldn't differ from one another more. But since, Leticia and Michelle, but especially Leticia, touched upon the question of COVID and how pandemics change the world, I think one qualitative difference that we see, and this is where the context of this question comes very strongly, is that finally the women leadership is not treated as something extraordinary, as a phenomenon that is rare and probably won't be repeated, but has established itself as a very incredibly strong leadership in New Zealand, you've mentioned, but also Denmark and Finland. And I think if you look at the Finnish Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, who is one of the youngest in the world, when she was getting her female cabinet formed, on social media and not only, were as friendly as to suggest that she is yet another Spice Girl of politics, that is going to leave us quite soon. And, a year later, one couldn't imagine a stronger leader. So what is the secrecy behind the leadership, you asked? And I think there are perhaps 3 words to describe that. And this is the, if you want, perhaps a suggestion. Leticia and me have been working last year a lot about the phenomenon of the female leadership. We've done some research work. And I think what it comes down and boils down to is to respect, recognize, and reorganize. Respect, because the female leader have been extremely compassionate. I mean, if you think about Jacinda Ardern, you think about someone who is natural among the people. She's always been like this, when in the youth organization and now as a politician. And what we are seeing, and in the video you have seen the clapping, is this absolutely humane idea of solidarity and the necessity. We know that there won't be a fix tomorrow, but people want to know that they are recognized. And they, as female leaders, are incredibly humane, incredibly recognizing. And therefore, the agenda that Jacinda Ardern, you mentioned maternity leave, but, what about the fighting gender-based violence? What about the medical leave in case of miscarrying, which until now has been a taboo and a very individual thing? So, this idea of being respect, humble, and humane, this is the first threat that we have in terms of a difference of the leadership. The second issue is to recognize. I mean, Jacinda Ardern has been going on the show like this one, dragging with her the female, by the way, researchers and scientists to say, I don't know. Nobody knows what this pandemic is about, but I want to get myself informed. I want to see alternative, and I want to offer people good, sound solutions. And, that has been incredible. This idea that, especially now in the 21st century, and Michelle has been so good pointing out how we deal with the digitalization, but, how we deal with the whole information revolution in the times when there is a crunch and there is a need to believe in science. I think that the female leader got it much better than anybody before, perhaps once again, because as the leaders, they have been sort of very open. And the last thing is to reorganize. I think where the leadership of all those leaders, and you've mentioned, of course, the humane part of being on maternity leave. I mean, Sanna Marin and Mette Fredriksson have gotten married. I mean, all that is planning for life, so to say. And so the leadership has also been planning for life, because they haven't been managing the crisis. They have been actually taking the crisis, changing the way of thinking, totally different than in 2008, and thinking about the future. All that those women leaders put on the table are the plans for a generation. So, there is a plan about talking about Finland 2050. There is a plan about how to change New Zealand to be much more of the gender equality country. And, it results, it resonates. People want that. Look at the last New Zealand election. I mean, from a minority party to an absolute leader. Look at Sanna Marin, from a spice girl to one of the most recognized, strongest, boldest leader. So once again, I would say that the secrecy behind that, and this is something that is a qualitative political change and is going to stay. And I think for that, we are in debt to all those bold women, which is respect, recognize, and reorganize.
Thank you, Anya. Wow, I'm looking at all the comments and I have goosebumps too, Priyanka. This conversation has been amazing. Thank you guys for participating in the chat. This was amazing. What a pleasure. To our panelists, thank you so much for your time today. This was such a rich and amazing discussion. And the discussion doesn't stop there, right? Ambassadors, I hope that you learned a lot from these badass women. Remember, you can be the change in your community. Stay connected, uplift one another, and keep learning through this forum. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.